Here, there.
Can you put on full screen?
You can put it on full screen or something.
I can make these bigger.
Yeah.
Yes, we see the mouth of the news on the left.
Okay, but now I can't see anybody. Is that? Oh no, I can actually see people in the corner. Okay. I'm not really the best at operating these things. I have to be honest with you. Is that going to work for us?
Huh?
Is that going to be okay?
For me, it's okay, but if you can do an F5 and go full screen.
5. Oh, I have a Mac, so I don't know what that means.
So,
What happened? Does that help?
now it's all black. No, it's all black now. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
We can do it like this.
How about I just do that?
Perfect. Perfect.
Nothing up and work, right?
Yeah.
See, I don't actually. I rarely use PowerPoint, so but I confess I was in a little bit of a rush, so I just cut and pasted rather than I usually work in something called LaTeX, which works much better. But not to worry. Okay, do you want me to? I sort of actually don't really know to whom I'm speaking, so if I may be going really slowly, I may be going really fast, and
You should go somewhat slowly because first, it's English. Yeah.
Okay.
And second, because the audio is not excellent. Let's just put it that way. The audio is not excellent.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we are communicating a long way away.
I can do just a fast introduction to show your book.
Oh, I like that.
It's propaganda.
Is that the Portuguese copy?
No, I don't think it's translated to Portuguese. Not yet.
It is. I know. We signed a contract. It's available in Brazil in Portuguese.
With whom?
Well, I don't know. I'm sure we signed a contract to do it in Portuguese.
I
haven't
find it.
I haven't actually looked for it because I don't speak Portuguese. So it would have been to me, but I'm pretty. It's in a lot of languages. It's in Spanish. It's in Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Romanian. I don't quite know what the audience was in Romania for it, but anyway. Can I just sort of plow away and talk? Shall I just get started?
Just let me do a quick introduction.
Okay,
So,
perfect.
we have Alistair Smith. He's a professor at the New York University. He wrote this book along with Professor Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. And if you wish to say something about yourself that I don't know of, you can do it, and then you can start the talk, or you can just start the talk.
I think I'll just start the talk. I'm not really.
Okay.
I have that British. We don't really do self-promotion. Okay, so I'm not entirely sure how to pitch this, so I just thought I'd put together some substantive things. So I thought I'd talk to you about something people tend to care about, which is the democratic peace. So this is what we might call an empirical regularity. It's something that we observe all the time. And the most famous observation, the one that people first thought about, was that democracies don't fight each other.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that they're just peaceful. Democracies actually fight other regime types. So they fight non-democracies. And one of the things I want to emphasize today is that they win, and they tend to win very quickly with low casualties. And they're also often, they often start the fights, and they have a whole bunch of other stuff that I could go on, and I've like a list of 12 things. But I want to focus on those sort of first 12 things as the major things. So I want to think about explaining the democratic peace.
Okay.
And this is some very early empirical evidence from a book by Bruce Russet at Yale. So this is, people have much better data now, but this is one of the very first tests. So I thought I'd show you this. And all he did was look at pairs of nations. So it would be Brazil and Argentina, and Brazil and Ecuador in each year. And in those pairs, he asked, did they go to war? And were both countries democratic? And I don't intend on having an argument about what we mean by democracy right now, because that I know when I open that can of worms, my entire class gets consumed with that question. So just for the moment, just buy the idea of democracy, because it's not going to be that relevant for what we're going to do anyway. Okay, so we're going to think about, are both countries democratic? We'll call that joint democracy. Or is one of them autocratic? And the observation is, I don't know if can you actually even see me or not? I'm not there, am I?
No. You don't see the slide.
Okay, so if I try to point to things, yeah, I'm looking very very stupid, right? Okay. So the top left cell there has 0 in. So this is the actual empirical evidence of the democratic peace, that there are no wars between joint pairs of democracies. And this is actually, this particular test is statistically significant around about 4% level. It's not massively statistically significant. Other tests have been much harder. And for a long time, there was almost a cottage industry of people trying to come up with counterexamples. But we're just going to take this as the case for the time being. So I want to think about why democracy is not just they don't fight each other. I also want to think a little bit about how they win. And how they fight. So if you want to think about the US, I'm sorry, everything's going to be US focused, because I know very little about South America.
I already have a question, but I think we can let the questions for the end of the talk.
All right. Well, I'll open up in a bit, but we might want to think about, let's pick on the one example there, like the UK versus Argentina fighting over the Falkland Islands. So the British sent their very best troops. And Argentinian, they rounded up, college students like yourselves at gunpoint and sent them to the Falklands to dig trenches to take on the British. So they fight in very different ways. We might want to think about the Republican Guard during the Gulf Wars. They were staying around to protect Saddam Hussein, not actually fight the Americans. And again, if we had time, I'd probably spend ages telling you about why the Chinese built the Great Wall, but it's, again, all for political reasons and nothing to do with military strategy. Okay, so what I want to think here, here's another table, because I told you democracies always win. So this is just whether you initiate, if you start a fight. You'd expect that the people who start fights win. I mean, if I'm going to start a fight, I'm going to pick someone I expect to be able to beat up. So we'd expect the people who start wars to win, which they do, both for democracies and non-democracies. But the sort of key result here is that even when the democracy is the target of aggression, they often win. So we sort of observe. Sorry?
The last line, target, win, lose. That's what you're talking.
Yeah, they lose. Targets lose a lot more regularly than the people who start. Right, you don't pick a fight with someone you expect who's going to beat the crap out of you. That's my general rule. And it's served me well thus far. Okay, so I want to try and explain these facts, and I could give you a long history on the intellectual tradition, and people have tried to explain them by democracies being nice, but I've seen U.S. foreign policy, and it's not about being nice. It's about winning, and the U.S. do incredibly horrible things, even though it's democratic. So I have never bought those arguments, and they do a lot of covert things, and democracies are actually quite prone to going to war against other democracies. It's just those events never escalate to war.
Yeah.
Okay? So we're gonna talk a little bit about that. So I think you wanted me to talk about the Selectorate theory, which is what the book is about. So I thought I'd do that very briefly, and I'm going to call this the Selectorate piece because I want to explain the democratic piece with Selectorate theory. And the key is that the fundamental assumption, I believe this wholeheartedly, and I would never start anywhere else when I'm trying to explain politics, is that leaders want to stay in office. They spend a lot of time getting there, so they want to stay in office as best they can. Okay, so I'm going to think about how do they go about doing this and institutional differences. So I'm going to think of the Selectorate, or this S. This is the set of people who have a say in who is leader. So in a democracy, we might think of this as being the voters. In a military junta, we might think of this as being senior military officers. And we're going to argue that the leader to survive in power needs a coalition of size W. So he needs to pick W of the S people to keep him in power. And if he can't do so, he's going to get kicked out of power. Okay? So I want to think about, that's why I said democracy is not that important here. What I want to think about is the size of W. Is W a big number or a small number? So in a democracy, so in the US, the Selectorate is the adult citizens. And to win the House, the presidency, and the Senate, you need about 22% of those people. You just have to place them well. Okay, so that gives you a ballpark, right? If it's a two-party system, you need to win half the seats in half the districts. Half the votes in half the seats will get you a majority in Parliament. Okay? And I know you have a low party discipline PR system, but that's going to make my head hurt. So I'm going to move straight along from talking about Brazil. But you might want to think an autocracy is a dictatorship, or a junta has a small coalition. You need to pay enough people to point the guns at everybody else, and that's your coalition. Okay? So what we want to think about is how are you going to reward these people to keep them loyal? And we're going to argue you can do two things. Public goods, these are things that benefit everyone. I'm assuming the social scientists there at least know a public good is a non-rival, non-excludable good. So national defense is a public good. If I'm protected from being shot by foreigners, then everybody's protected, and my enjoyment doesn't diminish your enjoyment. So that's a public good. And then we've got to think about private benefits, which just benefit only the people who receive them. So for the purposes of today's talk, we can just think of this as cash. I'm just going to give you cash. I could let you be corrupt and steal or insist people pay you bribes, but I'm just going to think of it as cash. It's going to make the talk just a little bit easier. Okay, so one of the things I think we should do is I thought I'd read you some famous advice. This is, I don't know how many of you have ever heard of Sun Tzu. He wrote this classic book about war, and it's been like 3 millennia or 2.5 millennia. It's been the sort of guidebook to fighting. So I just thought I'd get a little quote here. The skillful general does not raise a second levy, nor are his supply wagons loaded more than twice. Once war is declared, he will not waste precious time in waiting for reinforcements, nor will he turn his enemy back for fresh supplies, but crosses the enemy frontier without delay. The value of time, that is, being a little ahead of your opponent, has counted for more than either numerical superiority or the nicest calculation with regard to commissariat. Now, in order to kill the enemy, our men must be roused to anger. For them to perceive the advantage of defeating the enemy, they must have their rewards. Thus, when you capture spoils from the enemy, they must be used as rewards so that all your men may have a keen desire to fight on his own account. So that's sort of how to fight a war advice for the last 2.5 centuries. But it's massively different from how the US fight. And this is really small, so I'll just give you something. Firstly, I've called this Caspar Weinberger, but it's also very much similar to what Colin Powell, a former Secretary of State for the US, has said. It's basically don't commit forces unless it's absolutely vital. And when you put troops in, make sure you give them all the supplies you need. Make sure you have clearly defined objectives and political support to do so. And once you start the war, make sure you reassess and provide more supplies as required. And you've got to be really committed to this thing. So this is how the US fights. Completely different from how we expect people to have fought for millennia. So we want to think a little bit about why those would be so. And the key for us is that they're going to be very different institutional contexts. So Sun Tzu, when he wrote about how to fight a war, he worked for a king in the Wu tribe in the Warring State period in China. This is about 300 BC. He was beholden to a leader who was sort of tribal leader, only had to be responsible for a few people, so it was good advice. Ronald Reagan was Weinberger's boss, and George Bush was Colin Powell's boss, and the presidents answer to a lot of people. So we're going to think about why they have these different doctrines, and they're going to be different because you're going to advocate the policies that are politically important to you. That's sort of where I want to go with this talk. But I thought I'd actually give you some like bold quotes about, I don't know, things that people have found influential for centuries. Okay? So the general theory I want to argue here is about political survival and how you reward people. And the key is going to be whether you use private or public goods. So if the winning coalition, that's the number of people you need to keep happy, is small, private goods are a wonderful thing. If you have $1 million and you need to keep 10 people happy, that's $100,000 for every one of them. If you have $1 million and you have to keep 1 million people happy, just giving each of them $1 is not going to buy a lot of loyalty. So you might want to think about doing good things for the country. That's going to be the trade-off. As the number of people who need rewarding, just handing out cash becomes very efficient because the rewards get so diluted. Everybody only gets a little, and so people are going to shift the policy focus they have from private goods towards public goods in order to stay in office. And I want to think about the leader always making sure that she can offer more to her supporters than a potential challenger could offer to her. And one of the things I want to think about here is a lot of loyalty is that new leaders don't tend to keep you, the people that the transitional coalition often get replaced. So that's one of the things, but we don't really need much of that stuff right now. I'm going to explain the Selectorate piece, the democratic peace argument, using this basic theory. So I'm just going to go make things real simple. I want to think about a really simple war. I'm going to have two nations, A and B, and they're going to be at war. And what I want to do is I want to think about leader in nation A, and I'm going to give them a war chest, like this big pot of money, and they have to think about what they're going to do with it. They could spend money on the war, and they'd be more likely to win, or they could keep the money and give it to their supporters. And I want to think about the relative value of that trade-off as a function of political institutions. So we might think the victory is valuable to everybody. You always want your nation to win, right? I guess for Brazil, your football team win, right? It makes everybody happy when you win. I'm assuming one day I will see my football team win, and then I'll be happy. But until then, I'll have to think about wars. Okay. So I'm going to think about victory being worth a lot. In fact, you might be able to see. If I turn this off, can you see my blackboard? How do I see the screen?
Yes, just.
Don't know how to turn this off.
Compartilhar.
Is that better? Can you see me now? No?
Just go to share screen. I think if you click it again, it goes right to your camera. Yes.
Okay. So look, I'll tell you what, I'll do it on the board because I can. I should move my computer closer to the board, shouldn't I? There we go. So what I want to do is think about this trade-off people have. So what you could do is you could fight hard, or you could keep the money. They're going to be the choices. I'm going to just to make life real simple. Let's suppose, take the limiting case. If you spend all the money, you're going to win. Always going to win. And if you don't spend any of the money, you're always going to lose. So I want to think, what's the value of fighting a war? Well, if you fight and if you spend the money, you fight hard, you're going to win the war. I'm going to say that's worth V minus some cost. V is the value of winning the war. Okay? Minus some cost. This is a very sort of standard idea of a lottery. The probability you win the war goes up if you spend more resources on the war. But let's just do it 0-1. Alternatively, you could keep all the money and give it to your friends. Okay, so they don't get the prize, they just get this cost. But each of them is going to have that much money left to spend. So they're going to get W overall. God, maybe you can't even see that. Okay?
Yeah.
So you've got this choice that if you spend all the money, you have a good chance of winning. But if you spend all the money, you don't have it to give to your friends. So the question is, what is better for your political survival? Well, if you've got to keep millions of people happy, spreading this money thinly over them is not going to compensate them for losing a war. But if you were to win, but if you've only got to keep a few people happy, you could win the war, but your rival might be able to offer them a large share of this money, which would be much more valuable to them. So there's this trade-off is that when W is big, spending the money seems like a good idea because each supporter's share of the resources is small. But if you've got to keep only a few people happy, you're much better off keeping the money rather than spending it on your soldiers. So let's go back and think about the Falklands War, because it's the only war I can think of in South America I know anything about. How did the British fight? They spent all their resources sending their very best soldiers to the South Atlantic. And the Argentinians instead kept all their best troops at home. And so that's very much the difference. We see this relative degree of how hard people are willing to fight. Okay? So let me put some slides back on.
Just say one thing. Here, it's funny because you are British, so you call Falklands. But here in South America, people still don't call it that way. It's still like, for Argentina and its allies, it's still something of a hot topic. You know?
Yeah, they call them the Malvinas.
Yes.
That's it. But we won the war, so
for me, it's Argentina. So, but
yeah, see, that's the value. Is the value V of victory is that we call them the Falklands. If the Argentinians had won, right, Margaret Thatcher could have saved the cost of the war, given all the voters in Britain a little bit of money she saved from fighting the war, and we call them the Malvinas now. Right, that's the trade-off, right? That's exactly the trade-off. We get to call them the Falklands because Thatcher spent money to win the war. Argentina didn't try very hard. It kept all its best troops at home, mainly because the best troops were the ones that kept the regime in power, and they didn't want to get killed by the British, so they sent raw recruits. They didn't do very well, but it was politically, I mean, the regime fell apart after the war, but that's a slightly different story. Right, let me stick some slides back on because I don't think you can see I don't think you can see stuff very well. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay. You know what? I'll just pull up the slide. Does that say war? No. Maybe.
Huh?
Oops. Sorry, I've managed to. Does that say war outcomes and survival?
Yes. Yes.
So, if you're a small coalition system, think autocracy. Survival depends upon doling out private goods to your supporters, making them wealthy. Saddam Hussein lost the first Gulf War, but he preserved his resources, didn't lose his money, and just carried on giving it to the important people, the Republican Guard generals. And so he stayed in power till he was actually physically kicked out a decade later. Okay? Winning war is less important than retaining resources. If you're a Democrat, the private rewards for each supporter is very small, so what you want to do, you can't overcome a loss, so winning is important. And if you can't win, you're going to negotiate. So only pick fights that you can win and negotiate whenever you can. So I have a horrific graph that's sort of hard, and I want to think a little bit, though, about the kinds of wars that people would fight, and it would be lovely if I could point to this, but I can't. But if you want to think about easy wars versus hard wars, okay? If you're a autocrat, you can fight pretty much any war you feel like for transparent. You just have some reason you feel like going to war over something. Well, that's fine. It doesn't really matter so long as you keep your resources to pay off your supporters. You can go play war for a little bit. Just don't lose too badly, and don't spend the money. Don't spend the money that you're going to use for your supporters on the war. So don't try too hard. So you can start a war easily. If you're a large coalition system, it turns out you can actually win very hard wars because you're willing to try harder than a non-democracy. But, I mean, it's a little risky because you're blowing resources that you can't give to people. But these resources aren't large. So we've got this sort of decision to fight. If you're a dictator, a small winning coalition system, you can fight fairly freely because what you might lose, you can always compensate your supporters. If you're a large coalition system, you better make sure you're going to win before you fight this war Otherwise, you're going to get kicked out of power because you're going to have wasted your resources and you're not going to deliver any public goods for this. You're not going to deliver the public goods. So this is what we're expecting. Okay. So while we're here, we might think a little bit about, pardon me, might think a little bit about what nations fight for. So if you're a dictator, a small winning coalition system, you'll fight for private goods. So we might think of land, resources, slavery. Traditionally, wars were fought. You raided the churches, you stole the silver, you stole the land, you enslaved people. Going back to Sun Tzu, when you capture spoils from the enemy, they may be used as rewards so that all of your men may have a keen desire to fight, each on his own account. By all your men, I think he actually only meant the important generals. I'm sure he wasn't talking about the foot soldiers. But in the large coalition systems, people fight for policy. They fight for regime change. So when the US invaded Iraq, they didn't steal all the oil and pump it out. They just wanted regime change and stability. Well, we can argue about how well they did, but the US didn't occupy Iraq and pump all the oil out. That wasn't what they were about. So, the United States should commit forces to combat overseas unless particular engagement on occasion is deemed vital. So what I thought I'd do is just have a little look here about people's willingness to get involved in a war. So I've got a scale here. This is some work, empirical work I've been doing a long time, thinking of coalition size from the very smallest, W is 0, all the way up to W is 1. And then I just thought if we just divided it for a simple table into whether the fight would be easy or hard. Okay? It's going to be easy if your side are going to have 70% of the total military in the war. And it will be hard if you don't have more than 70%. Okay? And then just take a look at the proportion of wars that get fought. So the democracies, that's W equals 1, that's the penultimate column. We see that very few democracies fight tough wars. They fight easy wars. They pick on little people they can win. Okay? The 10%, it turns out those are odd cases. They're a bunch of cases in the Balkans before World War I. They're World War II, where all the Allies are trying to appease the Germans. So most of those cases are World War II, and Israel gets counted in there, although there were no Israeli elections at the time. But anyway, for whatever reason, I just used data that codes Israel as a democracy in 48. So those are the 10 cases if you're interested in what the exceptions are. Okay, what was I going to show you? Okay, so we have evidence that democracies are reluctant to fight wars unless they're really certain they're going to win. Autocrats, they don't really care because so long as they don't blow their resources, they can just go fight wars and do whatever they like for the sheer hell of it. They just don't blow too much money or you're going to be sunk. Okay, so let's think about the effort if we get into a war. So Sun Tzu recommends filling wagons no more than twice, then returning home. And Weinberger says continual reassessment of resources needed to achieve victory. Very different suggestions about how you fight. So I wanted to show you a little graph here. And I really wished I could point to this because it would be much easier if I could point.
Maybe use your mouse?
Maybe I could use the mouse. Yeah. Oh, does that work? Can you see the mouse? Okay. I never thought of that. I was like going to use my finger. Okay. Let's suppose I'm just hypothetically thinking about on day 0, year 0, everyone spends 100 on the war. Okay? And I want to think everybody goes to war in year 1. And I will think about how much does military expenditure goes up. Well, turns out nations of all shapes and sizes increase military expenditure on average 30% when they go to war. Now, if the war's over and you happen to be a small coalition system, in year 2, your defense expenditure goes right back to where it was before the war. Goes straight back to 0, back to baseline 100. If you're a democracy and you win the war, its spending goes down, but it doesn't go down all the way. The spending never goes back down to the same level. You might want to think about the British winning the Falklands War. They end up having to garrison the Falklands. The US winning the first Gulf War, they set up no-fly zone to enforce this policy settlement that costs huge amounts of money to make sure that Saddam Hussein are stuck by the peace treaty. So it goes down. So let's ask the more interesting question. What happens if you don't win in the first year? Now, presumably you fight wars you expect to win, but sometimes they turn out to be harder than you think, right? So if you're an autocrat, that's this line here, you spend on it. This is just based on statistical tests. We drew this graph, but the autocrats spend exactly the same amount of money following year. They don't increase their spending. They don't send the wagons back for more supplies. They just fight with the elevated, but they don't increase more and more. Whereas a democracy, what would a democracy do? In response to not winning in year one, they increase their expenditure even more in year two. And then it goes down after the war's won. But I just wanted to give you this idea about the willingness of democracies to first of all, they pick easy fights. And secondly, they try hard if they don't win. They keep trying more and more resources. Of course, this explains why democracies don't fight each other. Because who wants to fight a war that's going to be really hard to win? Why pick an enemy that's going to be really hard to defeat? You're going to pick someone that's easy to defeat. If you can't beat them easily, you're going to try hard. You don't want to pick on another large democracy because they're hard to beat and they're going to try hard. So that's why democracies don't want to fight each other in general. Now, democracies will pick on a little state. It's very easy for the US to pick on lots of small democracies. I'm assuming the history of Latin America will provide lots of examples of when the US has interfered or directly invaded or indirectly invaded small, weak South American, Central American states to change their institutions because it's easy to do so. It never escalates to a war because who's going to fight back against the United States? You're just going to get beaten. Okay. I knew I had something I was going to show you. So I thought what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is where do we, one of the myths that I always like to debunk. So the popular word by US presidents is to think about democracies want to go around the world creating democracy. So US presidents are very fond of saying, we want to promote democracy around the world. And I'm going to tell you, couldn't be further from the truth. There's relatively little interest in creating democracies. So everyone points to Japan. Japan's had the same government in power since the Second World War, with exception of about 4 years. So they've had one government for 70-something odd years. So, but we still call it democracy. Germany didn't have an independent foreign policy till the 1970s, okay, because the US were there. So everybody sees these are great examples, but there's relatively few cases you can look to where the US has created democracy around the world. So I sort of wanted to talk a little bit about why this might be so. Okay? And one of the things I'm going to sort of tell you is I'm going to shift subjects a little bit, because I thought this was an easy way to show it, and think about what I'm going to call an aid for policy deal. Okay? So nation A, donor A, is going to give, I'm going to make a deal. I'm going to give you some money if you do what I want. You could say no, but I want to think about how much I have to pay you to get you to do what I want. Okay? And I want to think about purely survival instincts here. So I want to think about how much I have to give you in order to get you to say yes. So I'm going to be the donor nation. I'm going to have $100. I suppose I have $100 in my treasury, and I need 50 supporters. The numbers are obviously very unrealistic, but they make the maths much easier. Okay? And everybody in my country hates communism. Okay? They don't like the pinko communists. I don't know quite your views in Brazil, but if you're in the US, we don't like communists. So it's worth $1 for us.
We talk after YouTube. Talk after we close the stream on YouTube.
Yeah. Let's suppose it's worth $1 for everyone in my country if they have an anti-communist party. Okay? So if I was to not do an aid deal, all of my supporters, I have $100, $100, 50 people, everybody gets $2. Okay? If I pay you to do my bidding, then every one of my supporters loses however much I give you, X divided by 50. But you all get to benefit from the public policy of anti-communism. Okay? So if I just do the maths, I would never pay you more than $50 to get the policy, because spending $50 to get $1 worth of anti-communist policy would be break even. So I'm only going to spend 50 at maximum. So let's think about from your response. I've offered you some money. How much do I have to offer you? Let's suppose you have $100, but you only have to keep 5 people happy. You're a small coalition system. So I might suppose that you actually don't like, it's your country, so imposing anti-communist policy might be even more painful than it is valuable to me. So I'm going to say it costs everybody $2. The pain of anti-communism in your country is $2. So without aid, if we didn't do a deal, your supporters could all get $20. If we gave aid, you have X more dollars to give out to each of 5 people. So I've got to think about how much do I have to give you such that it's a better deal for you to make your supporters more happy. So I got to give you at least $10. If I give you $10, your supporters would be indifferent between extra money and no aid. Sorry, extra money and doing the anti-communist policy, or not having the policy. So if I gave you $20, your supporters would be loving life. The citizens in your country would be mad as hell, because they're not getting any of the money and they're having to put up with a policy they hate. You may notice that US aid recipients really hate the United States. People who get massive amounts of aid, like Egypt and Jordan, really hate the United States, and yet we give them all this money. It doesn't strike me that it's for philanthropic reasons. Okay, so that's sort of a model for aid. So let's take this model for aid. What would I actually? Let me give you. I actually have an example that we actually did. So let me just give you an actual real example. This was we did. If you've actually got the book there, you can actually see us work this out. It's the back of an envelope calculation. But in the Iraq War in 2003, the US wanted basing rights in Turkey. They wanted to attack Iraq from both sides. Okay, so originally the US get to the point they offer $26 billion to Turkey. And so I figure Turkey's a population of 70 million. There's about $370 a person was the implicit bribe that the US were offering. Okay? So we did a little bit of rough calculation. Turkey at the time was fairly democratic. So for each person that the Erdogan needs to keep happy, that came to about $1,500. But that meant having a policy where you were going to let the United States go and invade a fellow Muslim country. And so the Turks rejected it. Okay? But as a thought exercise here, let's suppose Turkey was non-democratic, as it seems to be going in that direction, and you only have to keep 1% of the people happy. If only 1% of the population that's how many supporters you need, that's about 40K a person. So many people might have been more willing to let the US bomb a fellow Muslim country from its territory for 40 grand than they would have for 1,500. So that's sort of the calculation I want you to think about. So what's the incentives of the United States? Do they want to have democracies around the world? Well, they say they do, but if you have democracies around the world, democracies have to keep their own citizens happy. So it's much more expensive to buy policy from a democracy. If you make a country autocratic, you can buy them on the cheap. Okay? I refer back to US intervention in Latin America, like Guatemala and Honduras. Go in there, destroy nascent democracy because you put in a right-wing military junta and pay them off real cheap and get the policies you want. So the sort of predictions here, we get aid. Rich democratic donors give to poor autocratic recipients. But interestingly, the amount of aid you give somebody is, if the recipient is rich and democratic, you actually have to pay them more. So the US will give more money to rich democratic countries to get them to sign on. than you would to a poor autocratic country, but you'd be less likely to do it because the cost is too high. Okay, and we get some other things. In autocracies, citizens hate countries that give lots of foreign aid. So that's sort of an idea here. So I had a sort of a link. I was thinking a little in general. Just think about a simple policy game here, just to give you reseal the idea here. Is think about some international policy. You know, relative who's going to be influential in the United Nations, for example, and we might think it's a function of how much effort you make to lobby or buy votes. Okay? The more effort I make, the more the policy resembles my policy. So we could think I want to get it to 1 and you want to keep it at 0. It's a very simple game, and it's just going to be a function of our effort. Okay? Well, it turns out as your coalition gets larger, you make more and more effort. But as your coalition gets larger, if I'm trying to buy policy from you, it gets more and more expensive and I get less and less policy. What's the optimal solution for me to have is actually to undermine the institutions in your country, make you autocratic. If I make you autocratic, I can buy you on the cheap. So that's sort of my explanation for U.S. foreign policy. So that sort of leads me to the very sad conclusion that democracies create autocracy with very few exceptions. We can actually sort of think about where is it that the US has been good at creating democracies. Turns out they're all the countries that sort of ring the Soviet Union. Japan, South Korea, Germany, places where the people are more likely to have a pro-Western view than they are a communist view, and it makes it hard for the Russians to interfere in their politics if you make them democratic. But you can't control their policies. So they seem to be the successful place. Sorry, I'm going to leave you on the sad note that democracies create autocracy because that's what's in their interest.
You too close. Just
I don't know how to do anything. I've screwed everything up. I don't know what I've done.
First of all, let's thank the professor for the talk. Thank you very much. We can open for questions now, right?
Sure. They have to be in English, though. I'm sorry. Portuguese is terrible.
Não, no problem. Alguém tem alguma pergunta? Dá para outra pessoa traduzir e tal. Eu tenho perguntas, claro. No? So I think I will do the first question then. But it's a little. Just then sit closer to the microphone so we can hear you.
Oh, that's actually better.
By the way, I really loved your book.
Good.
The handbook is.
You should buy it for your 1,000 closest friends. They'll never have problems with insomnia again.
Also, the logic of political survival is way tougher to follow. I read the chapter 2 and a little bit of chapter 3 of the logic of political survival.
Oh yeah, I much prefer that book because it's just maths. It's so much easier to do maths than it is to. I really don't do proper nouns. History is very tedious, whereas doing maths is really enjoyable.
I have a few questions that I took off out of your book just because I had doubts, and they match the idea of talking about war and peace, which is the Iraq War of 2003, the second Gulf War. It's at least for someone outside of the United States, it's really tough to see how the constituents of President George W. Bush would have to gain on terms of public policy, on public goods. What do they have to gain about that? Because for us outside of the United States, it just seems like terrible geopolitics.
Yeah, well, Bush, the first thing you want to think about is Bush managed to transfer all. I actually have another book on exactly this topic about Bush was very successful at transferring all the financial cost of the war onto poor people. So he's supported in general by the rich, and he successfully transferred the cost. Wars are predominantly fought by poor people. The soldiers are poor. And in order to pay for the war, he had to ends up the Republicans have massively cut social programs. So the first thing to think of for his supporters, for the country as a whole, it was, I'm willing to buy that it was a terrible idea. But it was a really, really bad idea if you were a Democratic supporter. The Democrats were the party out of power. They're the ones that lost all the social programs that poor people wanted. They all got cut to pay for the war. For the rich people, they paid almost nothing. In fact, their taxes went down, and income for the rich people went up massively during Bush's time.
So it's public reward.
So it's a private reward.
Private. Sorry,
but it's not. So I make the distinction between all public and all private because it's easier to do the maths in a quick sense. But you always want to think about these as gradations. So even though national defense is a public good, it's private in the provision, right? You can have soldiers who live in a beautiful barrack. The generals have a beautiful barracks with fine wine and steak every night. Or you could train the men and give them materials, right? You still spend the same on the army, but the relative focus between defense and rewarding people is different. So that's one reason. But that's always present, even in democracies. Democracies may actually give away more private goods than autocracies because they're more productive because they also produce public goods. But the question you raise is what did he achieve? Well, he managed to convince a lot of Americans that Saddam Hussein posed a threat, and so they wanted to get rid of him, and they were very happy to see this threat removed. There was all this talk of weapons of mass destruction. It turned out to all be lies. But he very successfully convinced people that this was a pressing issue, and for the rich, it cost them nothing to fight the war. So ex post, I think there are a few people who would say it was a good idea. There were many of us who thought it was a terrible idea in the first place. But you want to think about here of pushing the cost. So this is the lesson in politics, is you want your enemies to pay for the things that you want. And so your friends get rewarded and your political enemies pay all the costs. That was very much how George Bush did it. So during his term, the rich got really rich, the poor got really poor. He got to fight a war, put it all on a credit card, and he did the ultimate thing for a political leader. He got re-elected.
Yes.
That thing. So,
but in the end, the Republicans lost against Barack Obama, McCain versus Obama in 2008.
Right.
Because of the war or because of the financial meltdown?
I suspect maybe it was the meltdown. We could argue over that. But the trouble is, in the United States, you've got to keep a lot of people happy. Right? There's 20-something million people you've got to keep happy to build a coalition. Right? And so you've got to deliver on public policy. Having a massive economic collapse for the Republicans, that's not delivering on public policy. So that's why they lost. Anyway, but that's very specific. It's actually very interesting. We did a book more recently looking at U.S. presidents.
The spoils of war. The spoils of war.
Yeah, exactly. And we did a little graph, and it turns out we took historians love to rank presidents from best president, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Hopefully these things mean something to you. And if they don't, just tell me to shut up. And then, the very worst are people like Harding and people even I've never heard of. But we just did a very simple graph of how many people got killed while they were president. So it turns out the best way to become one of America's greatest presidents, and more importantly, to get re-elected, is to get a lot of Americans killed. So all the great Americans are Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. First World War, War of Independence, and the Civil War. So they're America's greatest presidents, and they're the one that killed all the Americans. And actually, in general, except for Roosevelt, had terrible economic growth. So they didn't deliver peace, they didn't deliver prosperity, and that they won. So it's all very key is to make sure that you target rewards to your supporters. You had another question you were going to ask me about.
Huh?
You were going to ask me a second question.
And it's kind of counterintuitive to think that America's greatest presidents are the ones that get Americans killed the most. It's a little counterintuitive.
Warren Harding, who you probably never heard of, is America's greatest president. 0 people got killed in military conflict.
I actually know he died, I think, 40 days after the inauguration speech, right?
No, you're thinking it was later than that. You're thinking of William Henry Harrison.
Okay.
He died only 2 years into his term, though. The rumor has it his wife poisoned him on an aeroplane flight to stop the scare. He was apparently a philanderer, and there was a big scandal about to break, and his wife poisoned him. But that's a speculation. Who knows?
I have another question about the Marshall Plan. You even mentioned here a little bit, and you mentioned a lot in the book, that it may be an example of foreign aid that creates democracy, that ended up creating democracy. Can you explain a little bit more? Because when you take the book as correct, just for documentation, I love the book, but if you just take it as correct, it sounds like a contradiction.
Okay, so
it is foreign aid.
What I want to think about here is how, if you're a political leader, you need to survive in office, you need to pay your supporters to be loyal. Okay? So if you're really lucky and you have an oil well, then the money just flows in and you pay the people. You pay your supporters, they point the guns at everybody else and everybody's happy. Right? So that's the perfect thing. You make the country poor, uneducated, you don't build any roads, you make sure that the people are miserable, but miserable people who are isolated and uneducated can't rise up against you when you have loyal supporters pointing guns at them. That's golden. That's the best way to be a dictator. Okay? Now the problem goes, let's suppose you don't have any oil. Now you need to pay your supporters to point the guns at everybody else, but you've got to raise money. Well, how are you going to raise money? Well, then you have to have a productive economy. You have to produce something. So you need people to produce. So how do you get people to produce? You let them talk to each other. You give them roads so they can go to market. You let them use telephones. You let them talk and congregate in groups. Well, that's great because now they can buy and sell and produce things that you can tax, so you can make revenue, so you can pay your supporters. But the big problem for you is now these people might start saying what a miserable leader you are and trying to rise up against you. Okay? So, yeah, leaders need to liberalize to generate revenue if they don't have an easy form of revenue. Okay? So now here's the dilemma. A Western nation, let's suppose they genuinely want to promote economic growth. So they go, your country's poor, underdeveloped, you need resources to develop the country. So you get given the resources. What you do as a leader? Well, now you have a big pile of money. So you now can pay your supporters just as if it was oil money. So you don't need the people to work anymore. And if those people get to talk, they might say horrible things about you. So you keep them uneducated and poor. So the more, if you get given aid money, particularly money that's easy to steal, or however it is, if somebody builds a health clinic, that's a health clinic you don't have to build and you can save on that money, right? So now, every time you get given aid money, you convert it into cash to pay your supporters. And so as a result, you don't have to liberalize the economy. If you were poor, you'd need the people to do work, right? So, you know, I'm looking at the moment at Venezuela, right? That's
okay.
Right. Venezuela is a case where the Maduro, first of all, is oil money. Yes. Secondly, he's getting, I forget how much it was, but I think last year he got $5 billion from the Russians. I get the exact number, but because there was all this thing that Guidero was going to come to power and there was going to be a revolution. And so Bruce and I wrote an op-ed saying exactly the opposite. The army's going to stay loyal because he's got money to pay the army. So he's not going to liberalize. He's going to keep the people poor, disconnected, keep the road infrastructure terrible. And because hungry, starving people make really bad revolutionaries. Right, and so he can, as long as he can pay the army, he's going to stay in power. And so that's one of the mystery. That's one of the worst things about foreign aid. Now, if I was to give foreign aid to a developed democratic economy, the leader has more money, but political competition is the opposition can turn around and say, we have really good public policy ways of spending this money, because you've got to keep so many people happy. You know, even if you get $1 billion, divide it over everybody in the country, it's a few dollars each, right? So what are you going to do? You're going to have to invest that money in good public policy ideas to stay ahead of the political opposition. So that's why when aid was given to Europe after the Second World War and the Marshall Plan, the European countries had relatively large winning coalition systems. They had a history of democracy. They had democratic institutions. Britain got a lot of money, but it had this parliamentary government. You need to keep 25% of the voters happy. You couldn't just buy off 25% of the voters with the cash. There was nothing like enough to buy loyalty. So it got invested in economic development. So that's the problem. Everyone thought, oh, wow, a Marshall Plan was so good in lifting Europe out of economic problems. Well, that's because you gave money to democracies. So the leaders had to spend it on public goods. The economy flourished. You give Maduro a large amount of money now. Maduro's going to say, "Oh, that's great." Or even if you just give him food, it's like, "There's less money I need. I can now feed my troops. I can feed the people I need to do whatever work I need. I don't have to worry about anybody else. I can oppress them even more." So that's the sort of the dark side of aid, as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not either that, or you could just think I'm a really miserable human being who's not very nice and won't give anybody anything. One of those two things.
This theory seems. This theory of yours, of you guys, I mean, it sounds very powerful to even to try to predict things that will happen, at least to try to predict.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever been approached by some political agent or party to use these models to something?
We have measured. We tried to do very accurate forecasts of coalition size for the American government. I only ever wanted to know about like 10 countries. You can probably name the 10 countries they cared about. I can't tell you what they are, but I'm sure you can guess the 10 countries they cared about.
Russia,
we wanted
China,
to do a random sample, but
Russia, China, Venezuela.
Because I said, I'm neither going to confirm nor deny.
No, don't try it. Just in private. They are watching. Whatever.
I'm sure that the NSA listen to all of my phone calls. So
I have I have two more questions. I think they're easy. First of all, why are there state-run oil companies? Because when you look into countries that depend on oil, they usually have state-run oil companies to take the oil out of the soil. For example, Brazil, we have Petrobras.
A lot of countries don't. A lot of countries actually have a multinational will come in. Let's say Exxon will come in, and Exxon will pump the oil out the ground and then hand the leader a check.
Yeah, because the problem of having a state-run seems that if you have it, you'll have to build infrastructure in your country to make the state-run somehow.
Well, just think of the incentives from the incentives of a dictator and the incentives of the oil company are aligned. Right? So what does the oil company want? It wants to extract oil out the ground, give the smallest royalty it can to the leader, and it doesn't want to worry about expense on public services or saving the environment and keeping oil safely, right? Because it wants the leaders' incentives are exactly the same way aligned. If the political leaders want an autocratic system, because it's easy to survive as an autocrat, so they want a small winning coalition system. The oil company wants a small winning coalition because it can ignore the people, and they just bring in their own experts and they treat people in the country miserably. It's a sort of marriage made in heaven. The oil company gets to pump the oil. In some cases, the oil company is domestically owned, but that's more of a risky strategy for a leader, because now you're beholden to the person, somebody from your country, the oil minister. You're now beholden to that person because they can hold up the revenues that you need to survive in power, right? Whereas Exxon just want to pump the oil. They're not going to take over your country. That's not what they're interested in. The CEO of the oil company wants to stay in power, so he wants just to make money to pay shareholders so he can keep his job. So he's not interested in taking over your country, but the oil minister might be. So if you have a foreign company do it, then it makes it much easier for you to avoid being beholden to the head of the oil company. You have Petrobras, or is that Mexico?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right, but Brazil is reasonably democratic, right? Well, it's more democratic than it used to be when the military were in charge. Can I say that?
It's it's still democratic.
Right. I don't like to use the term democracy. I'd much sooner talk about how is the system rigged, such that what's the number of people the government really need to stay in power, right? It's clearly millions, right? Because Brazil's a huge country.
Yeah.
But it's not half the people.
No, definitely.
Right, they're going to cheat and lie and use media and gerrymander the districts and use media and stop opponents from getting to the polls and those kinds of things. So they don't need half the people. That's the degradation I like to think about.
It's still kind of complicated for me to understand state-run oil companies, but I think I took a little bit.
Okay.
Here in Brazil, we don't have gerrymandering. It's not like in this way, in district way. We call it electoral coefficient. It's as prone to being rigged as gerrymandering, but it's a different system.
Right, you have an open list PR.
Huh?
Open list proportional representation.
I think it is. I'll have to check it out because I only know in Portuguese the name. So.
Right. Yeah. Everybody actually really likes to study Brazil for politics because you have all of these strange rules that when a municipality hits a population of 100,000, they change the rules. So cities below 100,000 and above 100,000 have different rules. So people really like to compare cities with 95,000 and 105,000 because otherwise these cities might have been very similar, but the only difference is they're similar sized cities, but the difference and economically similar in many ways, but the difference is the rule changed. And so you can see how everybody loves to study Brazil for exactly that reason.
I didn't know. I did not know that. Interesting.
Yeah, no, there's lots of what's called, I don't know if any of you have done this, something called regression discontinuity.
Regression discontinuity.
Yeah, so this is it's like, you think that a city would spend more on healthcare as it got bigger. But the thing is that when you hit 100,000, the rules change suddenly. And so the amount they spend on healthcare will change rapidly the moment you hit that. I can't remember if it goes up or down. I forget how the systems go, but a lot of people study Brazil for exactly that reason.
Wow.
Logically, you can use leverage to address how the change in rules affects outcomes.
That's interesting. I'll have to look it up. Fascinating. Yes.
Okay. You should give me one question, then I got to go because I have to pick up kids from a babysitter.
Do you want to go? My part is over. Just let someone else.
All right.
Hi. I want to question your basic assumption about leaders want to stay in power.
Okay.
I'm not sure about democracies around the world, But here in Brazil, a president or any executive officer can only be re-elected once.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
after his first mandate, what happens? He can't stay in power again. Uh, what changes? I
So you're talking sort of term limits in general is an interesting phenomenon. So the first thing to think about is, when do they get enforced? They only get enforced in large coalition systems. In small coalition systems, people just get rid of the rule because it's inconvenient to them. So Vladimir Putin has effectively got around the term limits in Russia. That's very common. And is it Bolsonaro you have now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I suspect some of you are worried that he will try and get around term limits.
Yeah.
The other thing is, what I think of as a leader here, in many cases, you might be thinking of it as the party. The leader of the party often will put a mayor into the town, and so you might want to think of the party as the political leader. So it's this intergenerational entity that wants to retain control. So the individual might change, but the party leader might be more important than the actual mayor or the president, depending upon what we're talking about. And the other thing that's sort of really interesting is the kinds of policies they have, how people change their behavior as the term limit approaches. So if you're at the beginning of your first term, you probably do things, I'm going to call them public policy. You try and do things that are good for the nation. If you're at the end of your second term, well, you can't get re-elected. So what do you try and do? You try and steal stuff and you give it to your friends. So Bill Clinton famously tried to steal the White House furniture when he was leaving the White House.
Okay.
Right? In the US, it's very common for presidents to use their last term. They go around pardoning people. So all of their cronies have been locked up for political crimes. They go let them all out. So people change their policies as their time horizon disappears. There's no point doing good public policy if you're going to be out of office. So leaders want to get, so the short answer is leaders want to get around terms as much as they can. And also you want to think of it being the party that's in charge, not necessarily just the individual.
Do you have time to one more question?
Okay, be quick because I do have to go to I have to go to the babysitter.
All right, there's
Right.
one.
Right on daddy daycare all the time.
It's I think it's a fast question. Someone told me. I'm translating it. It's not my question.
Okay.
Our current president won despite being not exactly liked by big media, by the big media of Brazil, and some of the biggest corporations here that control entertainment and things like that. Can you talk about the role of media inside this theory, in a general way?
Yeah, of course. In general, what if you have the ability to control the media,
Mm-hmm.
you want to use it. If there's a very small winning coalition system, you
Mm-hmm.
want to use the media to say how wonderful you are, and to prevent the opposition from coordinating.
Mm-hmm.
So you close down opposition newspapers. Opposition tries to do exposés about corruption that you're doing, you close them down. You tax paper, you lock up the journalists.
Mm-hmm.
You don't lock up journalists who are saying wonderful things about you. Now, in large coalition systems, democracies, it's hard to do so because there are laws, freedom of speech rules, right, which we would expect to be there. People like freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good that people value. So politicians give it to people because they like it. They like to be able to say what they like. It's a reward. It's a public good to be able to say what you like. Okay. But as the coalition gets smaller, politicians are always trying to reduce the coalition that they have. So they'd love to stifle opposition. Right? It's great when the opposition can't get organized behind a single candidate. So if 10 opposition candidates run, the incumbent loves nothing more than that. Because you split the vote, you split the opposition vote share 5 ways or 10 ways. it's really easy to beat every one of them. So you control the media. You don't let there be free and fair media.
Okay, I
I think I should go. I better go. I got to go get my baby. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice.
Finalizar a transmissão.